Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Mm,
We're tackling something pretty interesting today, and something that you might not have heard a lot about, colorism.
absolutely.
We're going to be looking specifically at how it impacts Latino and Latina communities.
Yes.
And we're going to be using an academic journal article to guide us.
Awesome.
So get ready to unpack some pretty fascinating research.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into this. I think most people understand the concept of racism, like between different racial groups, but today's deep dive, we're really focusing on discrimination that's based on skin color within the same ethnic group.
It almost sounds like a form of internalized racism. Would that be an accurate way to think about it?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. And because it's happening within a group that already faces a lot of discrimination, colorism can be really hard to recognize and address.
Yeah, it makes sense. And the article highlights something that really surprised me. There's not a ton of research on colorism in the field of psychology. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, there are a few potential reasons for that. Um, First, it's a sensitive topic, right? It can be seen as taboo. People might be uncomfortable discussing it openly. Second, there can be denial. Some people might minimize or even completely reject the idea that colorism exists.
Yeah, it's like pretending the problem isn't there, which of course makes things worse.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, this lack of open discussion and acknowledgement impacts research funding, right?
Yeah.
Less funding means less research, and then that limits our understanding of the problem.
That's true. That's a really good point. Well, this really highlights the value of us having access to this kind of information, right? We're getting a glimpse into a topic that doesn't get enough attention.
Hmm.
So I think to really understand this, we've got to look back. We've got to understand the historical roots of this. So let's
Okay.
go back in time. Let's see how colorism took root in Latin America.
I love it. I'm ready to rewind. Let's do it.
Okay, I'm ready for a history lesson. Where do we start?
All right, so our source outlines three major eras that really shaped the foundation of colorism in the region. We begin with the Spanish Conquest, then we move into the colonial period, and finally we examine the postcolonial era. And so each of these periods played a role in kind of establishing this racial and ethnic hierarchy that continues to have an impact even today.
Wow. So we're talking about a legacy of discrimination that spans centuries.
Absolutely.
So let's start with the conquest. What happened during that time that laid the groundwork for colorism?
All right, so picture this, right? You got these Spanish conquistadors, and they arrive in a land with diverse indigenous populations. They bring with them, their weapons and their ambition, of course, but also their own deeply ingrained racist ideologies.
No, they weren't just conquering land. They were imposing their own belief systems as well.
Exactly. They viewed indigenous people as inferior, as heathens needing to be civilized, and this perception, rooted in European superiority, really became the foundation for social inequality between white Europeans and non-white populations throughout Latin America.
So it's almost like that initial encounter, that clash of cultures and belief systems, really set the stage for everything that followed.
That's a great way to put it. And then we move into the colonial period where this inequality becomes even more systematized.
Right. So after the Spanish decimated much of the indigenous population, they needed a new source of labor to exploit the resources of the New World.
And that's where the slave trade comes in, right? The forced migration of millions of Africans to Latin America.
Precisely. And the conditions that these people were subjected to were absolutely horrific. And on top of that brutal exploitation, you have the development of the caste system.
Oh, the caste system. Tell us more about how that worked.
Okay, so think of it as a pyramid, right? The Spaniards and their descendants are at the very top, enjoying the most privilege and power. Indigenous people and people of African descent, they're relegated to the bottom, denied access to resources and opportunities. And this system was the tool that the Spanish colonizers used to solidify and maintain their power. It's just a visual representation of inequality.
Okay.
And it's all based on something as arbitrary as skin color.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just symbolic. This caste system impacted everything. Social status, legal rights, education, access to wealth. And, this hierarchy persisted for centuries.
Okay, so we've got this deeply entrenched system of racial inequality. Then we move into the post-colonial era. You'd think that with independence from Spain, things would start to improve, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's free, everyone's equal, or not.
Yeah, not exactly. So while the ideal of equality was certainly there, the reality was much more complicated. Even though Latin American countries gained independence, the deeply ingrained beliefs about white superiority didn't just vanish. They were woven into the fabric of society.
So how did these newly independent nations try to grapple with this legacy of colonialism and racism?
Well, that's where the concept of mestizaje comes in. On the surface, it was about celebrating the mixing of races, the idea that everyone in Latin America was of mixed indigenous, African, and European descent. It was promoted as a way to unite the nation under a single shared identity.
It almost sounds like a positive thing, like, let's acknowledge our mixed heritage and move on from the divisions of the past.
That was the idea, and in some ways, mestizaje did challenge the rigid structure of the old caste system, but it also had kind of a darker side.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this darker side of mestizaje.
Well, while seemingly promoting unity, mestizaje also became a way for white elites to downplay their own privilege and maintain their grip on power. Instead of directly addressing the inequalities that persisted, they kind of swept them under the rug under the guise of this mixed race identity.
So it was less about achieving true equality and more about maintaining the existing power structure.
Yeah, you could say that. It's like saying we're all mixed now, so those old racial categories don't matter, while still benefiting from being on the lighter end of the spectrum. And our source highlights a fascinating example of this. Vicente Guerrero.
Who was Vicente Guerrero?
He was an Afro-Mexican who became the second president of Mexico, and he actually decided to remove race as a category from the national census. And his intentions were good. He believed that if people weren't categorized by race, social inequality would disappear. However, removing those categories actually made it harder to track and address the inequalities that still existed.
It's almost like trying to erase the problem instead of actually fixing it.
Exactly. And that's one of the complexities of mestizaje. While it did challenge the rigid caste system in some ways, it also became a way to obscure ongoing racial inequalities.
It seems like a classic example of good intentions gone wrong.
And the legacy of mestizaje, along with the whitening policies enacted to dilute non-white characteristics, continue to affect the lives of indigenous people and people of African descent in Latin America.
Wait, whitening policies? They actually had policies in place to make the population whiter.
Yes.
Wow.
It might sound shocking, but these policies encouraged European immigration, especially to areas with higher concentrations of indigenous and African populations. And they even went as far as sending white prostitutes to certain areas to, in their minds, improve the race through interracial breeding. And sadly, this idea of mejorar la raza, which means to improve the race, still persists in some circles even today.
Wow, I'm speechless. It really highlights how deeply entrenched these ideas about race and skin color are. So if these whitening policies were part of the picture, did mestizaje ultimately fix the problem of racism in Latin America?
Unfortunately, no. Racism persists, though it often operates in more subtle ways. Our source provides some striking examples.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about these examples. What forms does modern-day racism take?
Well, think about indigenous clothing and cultural practices. They're often mocked or devalued. Afro-Latinos are frequently stereotyped in the media, and the socioeconomic disparities that are a direct result of centuries of oppression. They're often blamed on the inherent traits of those groups rather than on the systemic factors that created those inequalities.
It's like blaming the victim for the very problems that racism created in the first place. It's heartbreaking. But surely people aren't just passively accepting this, right? There must be some pushback, some resistance to this ongoing discrimination.
Absolutely. And that's where we see the incredible resilience and strength of indigenous and Afro-Latino communities. The article highlights three movements that really exemplify this fight for equality: the Zapatistas in Mexico, the Mayan movement in Guatemala, and the Afro-Colombian movement in Colombia.
Okay, let's dive into these movements. Tell me about the Zapatistas.
Okay, so the Zapatistas are an indigenous movement that rose up in the 1990s to fight for land rights and autonomy. And they actually achieved a major victory with the signing of the San Andres Accords, which recognized indigenous groups as part of Mexico's population and granted them certain rights.
That sounds like a huge step forward. Did the treaty actually lead to real change?
Unfortunately, no. The treaty was never fully implemented by the Mexican government. They claim that it threatened national unity, which, as you can see, echoes that same desire for a homogenous society that was at the heart of mestizaje. Indigenous communities in Mexico continue to face disproportionate levels of poverty and discrimination.
It's so frustrating to see progress made and then stalled by the very people in power. What about the Mayan movement in Guatemala? What are they fighting for?
So Guatemala has the largest indigenous population in Latin America, and they face extreme levels of inequality. The Mayan movement emerged in the 1990s to address socioeconomic disparities and the horrific violence that these communities have faced. It's a truly tragic part of their history. Between 1980 and 1985, Guatemala witnessed a genocide that resulted in the deaths of an estimated 200,000 indigenous people.
That's a staggering number. It's hard to even comprehend the scale of that tragedy.
It's truly horrific. The Mayan movement has made progress in terms of indigenous representation in government and access to public spaces, but they're still battling poverty and marginalization.
It seems like a constant uphill battle. And what about the Afro-Colombian movement? What are their main concerns?
The Afro-Colombian movement is focused on gaining recognition and land rights. It's shocking to think about this, but Afro-Colombians were not formally recognized as an autonomous ethnic group until the 1990s with the passage of Law 70.
Wow. So even basic recognition has been a struggle for them. What did Law 70 actually do?
So it was a significant step. It acknowledged the multi-ethnic and multiracial nature of Colombian society and granted Afro-Colombians collective land rights to their ancestral territories.
That sounds promising. Did it bring about meaningful change?
It was a step in the right direction, but the lands that were granted are often the most neglected by the government, and they face violence and displacement. Poverty and low literacy rates continue to plague these communities.
It's like every step forward is met with a new set of obstacles. But it's inspiring to see these movements in Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia continuing to fight for their rights.
Absolutely. Their resilience in the face of ongoing oppression is remarkable. And what's fascinating is that we can draw some parallels between these movements and the struggle against racism in the United States.
Oh, interesting. How so? I'm curious to hear how this connects to U.S. context.
Well, think about mestizaje again, that idea of a mixed race identity that downplays racial differences. It has a lot in common with the colorblind racial attitudes prevalent in the U.S. today.
You're saying colorblindness in the U.S. is kind of like mestizaje's cousin.
Exactly. They both operate under the assumption that race doesn't matter or that we've somehow moved beyond race. But the reality, as we've seen in Latin America, is that ignoring race doesn't make inequality disappear. It often just makes it harder to address.
So let's dig a little deeper into colorblindness. What exactly are colorblind racial attitudes, and how do they show up in the U.S.?
Okay, so the article outlines 4 main dimensions of colorblind racial attitudes, or COBRA, and it's really fascinating. COBRA is basically a modern form of racism that's more covert and subtle than the overt racism of the past.
So give me some examples of how this plays out.
Well, one dimension is the persistent negative stereotyping of people of color and blaming them for racial disparities, basically focusing on individual behavior and choices instead of acknowledging the systemic factors that contribute to inequality.
So it's like saying, if you're not succeeding, it's because you're not working hard enough, without taking into account the very real barriers that people of color face.
Exactly. Another dimension is the idea that skin color is unimportant when it comes to social and economic experiences. You know, this belief in a meritocracy where everyone has an equal chance to succeed, regardless of race, just doesn't reflect reality.
It's a comforting belief,
Yeah.
but it ignores the realities of systemic racism.
Right. And here's an important point. Anyone can hold these colorblind attitudes, but how they impact someone's life depends on their position within the system.
So a white person adopting a colorblind perspective will have a different impact than a person of color doing the same because of the inherent power dynamics at play.
Exactly. And the source points out that light-skinned Latinos in the U.S. often benefit from white privilege, even if it's unacknowledged or denied. So even within the Latino community, there's this hierarchy based on skin color that's often invisible to those outside the group.
It's like this hidden layer of discrimination that operates beneath the surface. And it makes me wonder, is lumping everyone together under the label Latino actually part of the problem?
It's a complex question. Grouping such a diverse range of people under a single label can mask internal diversity. It creates this myth of a homogeneous mixed race group, which obscures the privilege that lighter-skinned Latinos experience.
So the label Latino, while potentially useful in some ways, can actually reinforce that colorblind perspective by making it harder to see those differences in experience based on skin color.
That's a great point. And research shows that darker-skinned Latinos experience worse outcomes in health, income, even mental health compared to lighter-skinned Latinos.
So even within that shared label, colorism is at work. And because of all this history that we've been discussing, the legacies of mestizaje and colorblindness, it can be incredibly difficult to even start a conversation about this within the Latino community.
Yeah, it's like this unspoken rule against acknowledging it. But if we can't talk about it, how can we address it? The source includes some really revealing quotes from Latinos about skin color and a table that outlines the denial tactics people use to avoid confronting the issue.
Those quotes and tactics sound fascinating. Can you share some examples?
One quote that really stuck with me was, "Marry a white person to better the race." It demonstrates how these seemingly harmless comments can actually reinforce a preference for lighter skin.
Yeah, it's like those backhanded compliments that reveal an underlying bias, even if it's not explicitly stated.
Exactly. And then there are comments like, "Your daughter is so beautiful, she's so white." These types of statements, while often intended as compliments, can send a message that whiteness is associated with beauty and desirability.
Subtle, but still perpetuating that hierarchy based on skin color. What about those denial tactics? What are some examples of how people kind of avoid confronting this issue of colorism?
Well, one common tactic is minimization. It's the idea that discrimination is no longer a major issue affecting minorities. We hear this a lot in the post-racial narrative.
Right, like saying, we had a black president, so racism is over.
Exactly. Or in the Latin American context, it might be something like, "There's no racism in Latin America, we're all mestizos."
Which, as we've seen, simply isn't true.
Right. Another tactic is rationalization. This is where people explain racial phenomena as just natural occurrences. It's like saying, "That's just how things are," or "That's life." It removes any sense of responsibility for addressing the problem.
So instead of seeing inequality as something that we can change, it's just accepted as an unchangeable fact of life.
Exactly. Then there's deflection, which involves ignoring the evidence of widespread systemic racism.
So how might that play out in a conversation about colorism?
It could sound like, "In Latin America, social class is more important than skin color."
Yeah.
Or, "I came to this country with nothing, so anyone can succeed if they work hard enough." Again, ignoring those systemic factors.
Right, those systemic factors that give certain groups advantages over others.
And the final tactic that the source mentions is something called competing victimization, which is also known as the myth of reverse discrimination.
Ah, yes. The idea that white people are now the real victims of discrimination.
Exactly. And while reverse discrimination can occur, it's often used to deflect attention away from the systemic racism that people of color continue to face.
So it's essentially using your personal experience to invalidate the experiences of others.
Right. And the common thread among all of these tactics is that they allow people to avoid taking responsibility for addressing the problem.
It's easier to deny or downplay an issue than to acknowledge our own potential role in perpetuating it.
Exactly. And that's why this article calls for more research and dialogue on colorism, particularly within the Latino community. We need to have honest and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about how skin color impacts our lives.
So it's about naming the elephant in the room as the first step to actually dealing with it.
Precisely. And the article outlines several recommendations for future research that could help us better understand the complex dynamics of colorism within the Latino community.
What kind of research are they recommending?
Well, they suggest focusing on the narratives of Afro-Latinos and Indigenous Latinos, exploring their experiences of both within group and between group discrimination.
So understanding how they're treated not only by the dominant white society, but also by members of their own ethnic group.
Exactly. They also suggest investigating how colorism affects Latino racial and ethnic identity development.
That's interesting. How does internalized racism based on skin color shape a person's sense of self? It seems like such a crucial question.
Absolutely. And they recommend exploring how Latino immigrants' understanding of race might evolve after coming to the U.S. and being exposed to the U.S. racial hierarchy.
That's fascinating. How does coming to a country with such a rigid racial structure impact someone who comes from a culture where those lines might be more fluid?
Right. It's a really complex issue. Finally, they call for research on how colorism affects family dynamics, such as parenting practices and sibling relationships.
It's so important to understand how these biases can be passed down through generations.
I agree. And the source really emphasizes the need for collaboration between psychologists and other social scientists to get a more nuanced understanding of colorism.
So it sounds like a call for a truly interdisciplinary approach to tackling this issue.
And one final recommendation that I think is particularly important is the development of multidimensional scales of colorism that researchers can use. This would allow us to measure the different ways in which colorism manifests and its impact on people's lives.
That's a great point. If we can't measure it, it's hard to track progress and understand the true scope of the problem.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging that colorism operates in both directions, benefiting some while disadvantaging others.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about a topic that I honestly didn't know enough about before.
Me too. It's been a fantastic conversation.
So as we wrap up, what are some key takeaways that you want listeners to remember from this deep dive?
Well, first and foremost, colorism is real. It's not just a matter of personal preference or individual prejudice. It has deep historical roots and very real consequences for people's lives today.
We can't ignore it, and we can't pretend that it doesn't exist.
Right. It's also important to remember that this isn't just a Latin American problem. Colorism exists all over the world, wherever there's a hierarchy based on skin color.
So it's a global issue that requires our attention.
Exactly. And finally, I think the source's call for more research on this topic is incredibly important. We need more data, more stories, and a more nuanced understanding in order to effectively challenge this form of discrimination.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface and there's so much more to learn.
And I'd like to leave our listeners with a challenge. Imagine you're a researcher tasked with designing a study on colorism within the Latino community. What questions would you ask? What methods would you use? How would you ensure your research is both rigorous and sensitive to the lived experiences of those affected by this complex issue?
That's a fantastic challenge. It's an invitation to continue the deep dive on our own.
Yeah.
What did you learn that surprised you today? What makes you curious to explore further? We hope this conversation has sparked some new thoughts and maybe even inspired you to take action.
Yeah, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep working towards a more just and equitable world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery. Until next time, keep diving deeper.